We'll read verses 36 through 50. This is the actual event that we alluded to in the first message. Luke 7, verses 36 through verse 50. And one of the Pharisees desired him, that is Jesus, that he would eat with him. And he, Jesus, went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee, which had bidden him, or invited Jesus, saw what this woman was doing, he spake within himself. So he's not verbally speaking, he's thinking. This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering, so Jesus read his mind, said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he saith unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, again, they're thinking, they're not verbally speaking, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said to the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee, go in peace. Without going into detail, but for the sake of clarity, what we read here should not be confused with another event with some similarities that are recorded by Matthew in Matthew 26, by Mark in Mark 14, and by John in John chapter 12. Two separate events. Events that occurred in a different place, a different time, involved different people, different circumstances, but most insist on making them the same. In fact, in most Bibles, it is in mine, the center reference, which is added by the translators, of course, makes them the same. And that's true in most Bibles. And one of the reasons for doing this is that the host in both is a man by the name of Simon, and in both, of course, involve a woman, which was a sinner. But in our text, it is Simon the Pharisee, and the other, it is Simon the leper. Again, different place, different time, different people, different circumstances, not the same event. And we could preach a message on that, that's not the point. Our text begins, and one of the Pharisees. Reading on, we see that his name was Simon. And he desired him. That is, he desired that Jesus would eat with him. It's not that he has any personal interest in Christ. For just prior to our text, the Pharisees had determined collectively that Christ was a blasphemer, and they hated his message. They found it very, very irritating. In fact, the thoughts of the host here, Simon, are brought out in verse 39 when he thought to himself, this man, if he were a prophet. So he's filled with doubt concerning Jesus Christ. Following the opening statement of our text, and one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, there's a statement of grace and mercy. And he, that is Jesus, went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. That's grace. That's mercy. From verse 49, we see that there were other invited guests, and they that sat at meat with him. So there were others that were there as well. No doubt, most, if not all, were Pharisees, and they sat at meat with him. So what we have here is not what you and I are accustomed to in our culture. They're not sitting, and we brought this out before, they're not sitting in chairs at a table, as is our custom. So we need to get the picture here. There is a table, and around that table there are what you and I would call lounges or couches. No backs, no arms, and they're elevated at one end, that being the head. And upon these couches, they're in a reclined position. Their heads, of course, are toward the table, and their feet are away from the table. It was also very common for other guests to be standing along the walls, and it was common for some in the area to come in uninvited. There's a meal, and let's go eat. Besides Jesus and the other invited guests, we read in verse 37, and behold, a woman. No doubt she resided in the area, for she was known in the city. And it is specifically stated that she was a sinner. She was known to be a very sinful woman. Now, with regard to this woman, in verse 37, again, and behold, a woman. So our attention is directed to this woman. You'll notice it is not, behold, one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him. But it is, behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner. Now, she has a different reason for being there. She's not invited. She has a different reason for being there than all others in that house. Now, what transpired that day in that house is recorded in our text. What happened in verses 37 through 39, what this woman did, is what led Christ to speak to Simon in a tone of rebuke, verse 40, the parable of the two debtors, which we read in verses 41 and 42. The parable is followed by verses 43 through 47, Christ makes application of the parable. And then in verse 48 and verse 50, Christ in that house ministers to this sinful woman. And in verse 49, we see the effect that this had upon the guest. Who is this that forgiveth sins also? Today, many saved individuals seem to be looking for motivation, for reason to serve God. And what we have here provides all the motivation, all the reason that you need. The subject is living the life of the much forgiven. Living the life of the much forgiven. The parable is for the purpose of explaining this woman's behavior. Jesus, speaking to Simon, gives this parable to explain to Simon the difference between Simon and this woman, and also to explain the behavior of this woman. So, let's look at the parable. What this woman did is described in verse 37 and verse 38. We see her act. Who she was and what she did greatly displeased and even disgusted Simon the Pharisee. Verse 39, now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touched him. He's disgusted by the fact that she touched him and that he allowed her to do so, for she is a sinner. So, in the parable, there are three characters. There is a certain creditor. He, of course, would be representative of God. And then there are two debtors, representative of sinners. Of these two debtors, one owed 500 pence and the other owed 50. Now the debt, of course, has reference to sin. Concerning these two, we read in verse 42 that they had nothing to pay. So they have this debt, and they have no means to pay the debt. And we read that the creditor, which represents God, frankly, that is, without any strings attached, forgave. That is, he absolved them both. He absolved them both from their debt. Jesus then asked Simon a question. Verse 42, regarding the parable, regarding the two debtors in the parable. And the two debtors are really pictures of Simon and this woman. And the question is, which of them, the two debtors, will love him, the creditor, the most? Simon, using human reasoning, and he was correct, verse 43, responded that he who was forgiven the most. And Jesus said, thou hast rightly judged. Then Jesus makes application. Again, he's speaking to Simon. And it serves as an explanation of the behavior of this woman. In verse 44, he says to Simon, I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet. In other words, Simon, I entered into your house, and you did not even show me common courtesy. That was just a common, courteous act. But she hath washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Notice also verse 45. Thou gavest me no kiss. In other words, Simon, I entered your house, and you showed no affection toward me whatsoever. None. And then we read, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. You see, he's drawing a comparison between Simon and this woman. He goes on, he says, my head, verse 46, with oil thou didst not anoint. That is, you showed me no special attention, you showed me no special honor, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. The reason for her actions, verse 47, for, in this case meaning because, she loved much. The reason she's done this, Simon, is because she loves me much. In other words, you don't, she does. Christ is not only drawing a contrast between this woman and Simon. Again, he is explaining the reason she did what she did. So remember the question of Christ following the parable, which of them, the two debtors, will love him most? And Simon's answer, he to whom he forgave most. And Christ said, thou hast rightly judged. This woman had already been forgiven much. And this explains the foundation of her love for him and explains her acts toward him. So this woman realized and felt herself much forgiven. She's referred to in verse 37 as a woman which was a sinner. Like all of us, she was a sinner by birth. That is, she was born guilty and depraved before God. She was born in the filth and vileness of sin. She was born in corruption, born in the pollution of sin. She's under the curse and the damnation of sin. And like the two debtors in the parable, she is under obligation to a creditor. But she has nothing to offer. She has a debt that she cannot pay. And everyone enters this life with a debt that they cannot pay. Everyone. Like all of us, she was also, being a sinner by birth, being a sinner by nature, she was a sinner by practice. That is, she lived a life of shame. She lived a life of dishonor. The fact that she is referred to as a woman in the city which was a sinner speaks of the fact that she was a notorious sinner. She was a great sinner. She was considered to be one of the chief sinners. She was considered to be very vile. She was considered to be defiling. Sin was her occupation. Sin was her livelihood. She had no doubt defiled many through her life, and no doubt had brought grief and heartache to the lives of many. And when people would see her and talk of her, they would simply refer to her as the sinful woman. And everyone knew who she was. And when someone said the sinful woman, they knew who they were talking about. She was a sinner. She was marked. She was labeled. And everyone knew who she was and what she did. Everyone knows that. And we're not told what she did. Most assume harlotry, but again, we're not told. But everyone knew. Whatever her sin was, everyone in the city knew. Now notice verse 39 again. When Simon saw what she did, if this man, if he were a prophet, would have known, as everyone else does. And he acts like she does, that he doesn't even know who this woman is in Simon's mind. Who and what manner of woman this is that touched him, for she's a sinner. As a sinner, she lived outside of the grace of God. She was doomed. She was at enmity with God. She was a rebel against God. A child of wrath under the condemnation of God. But she'd been forgiven. And that's obvious. She'd been forgiven before she went to the house because of the parable. Jesus is explaining her behavior. She had been forgiven of her sins before she entered the house. But she entered the house that day with the personal realization of the fact that her sins were innumerable. And she realized, she had a personal realization of the vileness and the filth and the wretchedness of her sins. She had some realization of how filthy her sins were and how contrary to God her sins were and how that her sins were against God and were wicked acts of rebellion and opposition against His person, against His will, against His holiness, against His authority. She had a personal realization of what she deserved as a sinner. But she also knew what God's grace had done for her. And she knew that all of her sins and all their filth had been taken off from her, had been carried away out of sight, not placed to her account, blotted out, put away, removed. She had personally experienced this, and it was all very real to her. And the result of that is, based on the parable, verse 47, she loved much. Why did she love much? Because she was forgiven much. And I believe what that means is she had an awareness that she was forgiven much. Simon had no realization of personal sin. Therefore, he did not love much. But she did. So the fact that she had been forgiven is what inspired her, what moved her to do what she did. So let's look at her behavior. Verse 37, we see that she had a very special interest in Jesus Christ. It says when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house. Now, I'm sure that the news was all over town. Jesus has gone to the house of Simon. But that news did not affect a lot of people, did not concern them, didn't mean anything to them. But when this woman, who has been forgiven much, and as a result loved Him much, when the news reached her that Jesus went to the house of Simon, she went there to see Him. Jesus was her Redeemer. Jesus was her deliverer. Jesus was her physician. Jesus was her hope, her joy. So all she had to do was hear that Jesus is in that house. And she's in motion toward Him. She loved much. Because she loved much, she was attracted to Him. She was drawn to Him. And when you know that you've been forgiven much, you love much, and there's an attraction, and there's a draw to Him. She enters that house and she's overflowing with excitement, with passion, and yearning for Him. She's not there for any other person in that house. The only reason she's there is Him. She comes and she has a readiness to do something. Again, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, and then notice what it says, she brought an alabaster box of ointment. She had been forgiven much. She has an opportunity to be near Him, and she's ready. She's ready to serve Him. She's ready to express her love to Him. She wants to praise Him. She wants to thank Him. She wants to acknowledge Him as her Lord and her Savior. Christ is her priority. Christ is her desire. She loved much because she had been forgiven much. So when she hears that Jesus is in the house, she does not linger. She does not hesitate. But with fervency of desire and with great joy and excitement, she takes the alabaster box of ointment. She does so with intent. And she goes to where Jesus was. Now think about it. This woman who knew that she had been forgiven much, she knows that Simon is a Pharisee. She has to know that other Pharisees would be in that house. And she knows that these Pharisees and all that would be in that house hated her. And they condemned her. And they had shunned her. And she knew that if she entered into that house, she would meet with frowns and looks of disgust and critical words from the Pharisees. But the love for the one in whom she had been forgiven much overrides all those other things. People will say, well, I don't go to church because so-and-so's there. Really? First of all, that's not the reason. You're not going there for them. You're going there for Him. And it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. It didn't matter to her. Her love was uninhibited. Her love was out without reservation. And she went to that house knowing she was hated. But she went there to honor and worship Him because she had been forgiven much. She was not going to let anybody or anything keep her from the one she loved. She took her place. She gets to the house. Remember the couches at the table. People's heads are toward the table, their feet or away from the table. We read in verse 38 that she stood at his feet behind him. So you can get the picture. She had been forgiven much. She loved much. Her heart and mind is fully absorbed and taken up with him. There may have been some comments when she entered the house. It's not recorded, but I'm sure there were. But she's taken up with him. If they're saying anything about her, she doesn't even hear it. Because she's solely taken up with him. And in great humbleness, she stands at his feet. And as she is standing there, her emotions were stirred in the presence of Christ. She came to express her thankfulness. She came to praise and worship him for what he had done in her life. And we see her in verse 38. She is standing at his feet and she's weeping. She's weeping. And I believe when she saw him and thought of the sin of her life, what he had done in her life, and what he had done for her, she's overcome. And she begins to weep. And the thought, as she thought upon her sins, she wept. When she thought about whom she had sinned against, she wept. When she thought of his love, his grace, his mercy, she wept. She thought of her unworthy state. She wept. She wept, she wept, and wept. And then the thought came to her mind, I can use these tears to clean his feet. A courtesy that had not been shown to him by Simon the Pharisee. So it says she began to wash his feet with tears. So now she's in a kneeling position of some sort. And then she takes her hair. She takes her hair down and begins to dry his feet with her hair. And then it says she kissed his feet. And this is probably what disgusted Simon more than anything. She kissed his feet. And then it says she broke open the box and anointed his feet with the ointment. She did so in praise, in thanksgiving, in adoration, in love, in honor, in worship. She opened that box of perfume and poured it all out upon Christ. That is exactly how we are to come into the house of God. We're to come with an alabaster box, what we are going to present to Christ. And we come because of what He's done, and as a result, we love Him much. Now, Simon the Pharisee was absolutely disgusted with this woman's behavior. And Christ, knowing his thoughts, told him Simon, you're nothing like this woman. You're nothing like her. And she's nothing like you. She had been and personally knew that she'd been forgiven much, and therefore she loved much. And again, this was the reason for her behavior. This is the life of the much forgiven. When we realize that we've been forgiven much, this is our life. It really doesn't matter how many sins you've been forgiven. Perhaps one person had more sins in their life than you did. But you're capable of committing any sin. But that's not what matters. What matters is the realization, I've been forgiven much. And when we realize that, again, the parable, we love much. And the parable is describing or explaining this woman's behavior. So as a result, the Lord is glorified. And there was further assurance given to her. He said, thy sins are forgiven. He's assuring her, your sins have been forgiven. And then in verse 50, thy faith hath saved thee. He's assuring her, go in peace. We know that much has been forgiven. And then the Lord comes and He assures us that much has been forgiven. And what does that do? That fuels her love, which in turn fuels the life of the much forgiven. We are the much forgiven. Hopefully we are not Simon the Pharisee, but we are the much forgiven. And because of that, we're to love much. It's just the natural course. So for you and I that are saved, when we think of the fact that Jesus Christ stepped out of eternity into this sinful world, and we see Him in His earthly ministry, and what He's doing is He's weaving for us a robe of righteousness, all for us. And He takes all of our sin upon Himself, and He goes to Calvary to pay our sin bill, to pay our sin debt, which we could never pay. How can we not love Him much? How can we not love Him much? When we think of the fact that Jesus paid it all, paid the debt that I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. All because of Jesus, a hell-deserving sinner on their way to heaven. How can we not have the attitude of this woman? How can I not live the life of the much forgiven? So for you and I that are saved, we are the much forgiven. That's us. Corresponding to that, according to the parable, there should be a life that is lived with regard to the one through whom we have forgiveness. Thank the Lord for the forgiveness of sins at salvation. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.